leave, I might want to
You're going to start it off.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello? Anybody out there? All right. I know you're all eating and chewing, but I just want to make sure everybody's out there and awake. It's good to see you here at what I am confident is going to be a very, very interesting presentation. This series is part of a series we're doing on innovation. A couple of years ago, we did a series on innovation where we brought in people from the outside to talk about what they were doing. And this series concentrates on faculty and staff and researchers who are working here at the school. And it has a couple of purposes. One is to report to the rest of the community about the kinds of interesting research that folks are doing. But it also has kind of a pedagogical, retrospective component to it. And that is that we ask our presenters to say, knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently as you pursued your innovation? So that we can all benefit from the lessons of our colleagues. So today we have a very interesting presentation on the Scenario Lab that Professor Riley has been developing over the years. I have a very long introduction about Professor Riley, but I think
you do not need to
which
read.
I think most of you in the room know the great work that she's been doing on organizational communication, both at the conceptual and theoretical level, as well as being engaged with practitioners. She's here with Zhan Li, who holds a BA in social and political sciences and an MPhil in social anthropology from a university called Cambridge. That's in English. So we're delighted that both of them are here. So I turn the floor over to Professor Riley. I have to apologize in advance. I'm going to listen briefly, eat, and then run to yet another much less interesting meeting. I turn the floor over to you.
But it's one where we hope he brings back money. So those are very good meetings. I want to thank everyone. It's the last week of school, and it's not the best time in the world to be doing presentations, because I know that people are studying and a number of us are trying to get our grading finished. But there was an important reason for this group to try to do this before the term ended. We've been invited to do a presentation at the Institute of Futures. And so this in some ways is a dry run to let them know what we're doing. And so that's very exciting. The team is not all here today, and I also want to do a thank you to Katie Chamberlain, who is one of the global students who's also been working with us on one of our survey instruments. And so we've got the group of people sitting here, and I wanted to recognize them for also being our lab manager, besides working on the Scenario Lab. Sandy Evans and is going to be talking in just a couple of minutes, as will Elisheva Weiss, and then Yasuhito Abe and Laura Alberti. Except for Sandy, I don't know that I say anyone on my team's name properly, but you know, that's the brilliance of Annenberg and all of the wonderful international students that we have. We've also got people helping us from all around the world. Noah Radford, who's with GBN and MIT. I met for the first time to work on this project in London, and Stuart Candy, who's with ARUP, which is a very interesting futures organization, is at the University of Hawaii. And then two of my former PhD students, Jen Gibbs, who's at Rutgers, Lou Tang, who's at Alabama, and also Rebecca Heinow, who's at Georgetown. We'll be working on the WorldBank project, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. And so we've got other partners on campus, and we'll try to talk about them as soon as possible in this conversation so that you understand how many people have been helpful to us in this project. What we are trying to do, I think, is displayed by the word foresight, which is in the middle of all of these other issues. One of our slides at the end of this presentation talks about sort of our lessons learned. But just to give you a quick preview, one of the things that we're trying to do in general is help organizations and people build the capacity for foresight. And foresight is the concept that you can strategically plan and think about the future, that you can imagine your future, and that the whole notion of the future to some degree is being created by different drivers and trends that are taking place in the world. But to another degree, it can be built. And the whole notion of the Dean's Innovation Series is the concept that we can build the future, that it's not just predetermined, it isn't just what's going to happen because you're following a series of trends. But it's how do you try to build the capacity for people to think differently about the future, to create an alternative future. And so that's what we're absolutely most excited about. What the genesis of this project comes down to is an experience that I had probably almost 15 years ago now. It's been quite a while. I was Annenberg's principal investigator to bring to campus a research center. It's actually a UARC, the University Affiliated Research Center. And it's called the ICT, the Institute for Creative Technologies. It's paid for by the Department of Defense. And the original grant was for $45 million, and then 5 years later we got an add-on for $100 million. And then there's been continued money. And so this is a big money project. And one of the things that they did to get the creative people and the social scientists, in other words, the folks who knew nothing about the military, knew relatively little about gaming and simulations, to get us trained, they put us through a training program. And so we went through the simulations just the way a new admiral or a new general would. And so I learned a great deal, both about the role of games and simulations, how you can use future thinking, the concept of scenarios and simulations, to try to create a world that looks different from the one that we have today. I mean, they gave us all call signs, and it was all, sort of this virtual gaming. I was Iceman. And so, that's, just one of those lovely stories that I don't have time to tell. But what we're doing is we're trying to build on that. And we decided at the end of, our training that at some point in time, we at the university ought to build a scenario lab. And we needed to create better games. We needed to create better ideas for the future, and to really try to hone in on the concept of foresight and the role that communication plays in foresight. The thing that makes scenarios so interesting is that it's almost always done by some kind of group, a community. We're going to talk about some of the alternatives. But the whole concept is that you get people together and they build it together. They start to see things together. And so the whole concept of scenarios, besides the fact that it's about stories, is also about the communication process in developing those scenarios. And so we're trying to make this foundational, and we decided a couple of years ago that the time was right to do this because we were starting to build this notion of communication at the center. And scenarios allowed us to find a platform to do experiments around communication at the center. And so this is the website, anyone who wants to get online. We have one of the better URLs. It actually is USC Scenario Lab. And so there's nothing hard to remember about it at all. And the lab talks the website for the lab talks about the research projects, the people involved, the different ways in which we try to bring different kinds of scenario thinking, not just our approach to what everybody is doing. And so what we're trying to do through the lab is develop a different approach to scenarios. And Zhan will be talking about that more in a little bit. But the sort of large, overarching research question for the lab is how are narratives building, the sustainable capacity for foresight. And so we're going to be looking at different kinds of projects that we're not going to talk about in any real detail. We're having each of the lab members do 2 or 3 minutes on some of the bigger projects, because this isn't a research presentation as much as it is a dialogue, and we've left lots of time at the end for questions. So, but we're working on sense-making, systems, cognition, and trying to work on the diversity of the approaches to scenarios and how it is that we can help people figure out what the future could be. It's important to remember as we go through the different projects that the notion of scenarios is not like some of the futures organizations. It's not about predicting the future. It's about finding plausible things that could happen, possible alternatives, and figuring out what all of the different drivers are. And then we are particularly interested in how people come together to start to learn what they think the future looks like. Or, as Elisheva will explain, what people don't think the future looks like, which is really interesting. In order to do our own version of training, we use the Beyond Broadcast Conference to start working with some of the students on running scenarios and giving them experience. And we had 4 scenarios at the Beyond Broadcast Conference, one focusing on Europe, one focusing on India, one focusing on Africa. And then I did the one on the American business industry, which after it was over, I started calling the James Bond future, because there were these, sort of 4 dominant scenarios. We're going to put ourselves in a position where the only thing that happens is, everybody's going to die, all of the newspapers are going to go away. We've also got the notion that there will always be these grand papers, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, although the New York Times just announced, I think it was Monday, that their profits for this quarter were down 59% from the same quarter last year, even though the subscription model is, starting to grow slowly. Or Thunderball, which is what people call Google, the whole notion of the aggregator. And then there's the concept that, the future of news is just whatever any individual person wants it to be. And so the whole concept, though, is that you can take this notion, you can wrap stories around concepts, and that you can try to help people figure out what their future is like. The next big project that I'll be working on is one that's part of the WorldBank project. Carola Weil is my main partner in this project. It's a 5-year program with the World Bank. The World Bank Institute has funded the preliminary work, and then the World Bank people seem to believe that George Soros and Bill Gates are going to pay for the rest of it. So we'll find out, whether or not that's actually accurate. And we're going to be developing scenarios that look at the role that communication plays in good governance. And it's a focus on Africa and on the Middle East. There are other Annenberg faculty who could not be here today because they are out of town involved in this. Tom Holohan, Rebecca Weintraub, and a couple of other people. So, Rebecca may be in town, but Tom's out of town. So this is sort of the concept. The scenarios can be looked at in terms of how simple they are versus how complicated they can get, the more complex and emerging sorts of scenarios where there isn't a whole lot of data now to help people understand what the future might look like, or they might actually be completely novel. and some of what's happening in the Arab Spring right now is a very good example of what nobody exactly predicted, right? Zhan, why don't you?
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the big picture perspective on what innovation means in the scenarios field and in the futures field. And I'm going to try to briefly lay out what we think is the great opportunity for research and innovation in these fields. This is a really key moment for the transformation of futures. I mean, the previous kind of golden age of futures, which was once called futurology, was back in the 1970s and 1980s. But it's really resurging these days in terms of demand for scenarios and futures work. And the reason for this is that the more uncertainty there is in the world, the more awareness of uncertainty there is in the world, and the more sense of that being a threat or a danger to organization and society, the more demand there is for this kind of work. Another reason why there's a big opportunity here is that the scenario and futures field itself has been traditionally dominated by consultants and practitioners. It's slowly shifting to become more influenced by academic institutions and academic researchers. So there's a big opportunity for more rigorous theory building. And finally, I think the most exciting part of the opportunity that we see is that, ironically, scenario planning and futures have been slow to adopt to online media and new media. That kind of experimentation is only starting to emerge in the last 1 or 2 years. So there's relatively few organizations are starting to do it. We're actually one of the master folks. So the Web 2.0 revolution has only just started in scenario planning. There's various reasons for that, which I won't get into now. But I'll just give you an example of one of the projects that it's just at the proposal stage at the moment, but we're very excited about, which kind of illustrates very well this kind of opportunity. And this is we're in talks with the Civic Paths group on Henry Jenkins. And that is a group which is dedicated to civic media and young activist organizations. And we have this idea of a collaboration which will aim to spread futures thinking and scenario planning practices through participatory culture, which does 2 things in terms of innovation. One, it teaches long-term thinking skills to young and civic activist groups. And secondly, it demonstrates how participatory popular culture in the new media era can be effectively leveraged for futures professionals. And that's really important because one of the main reasons why the futures field has lagged in adopting new media and online media is that there is the old guard which came of age in the golden age of futurology, who are very skeptical about popular culture and new media. And I'm going to hand over to some of the other team members now, and they're going to tell you more about the other projects.
I should mention that Zhan and Sandy, Elisheva, Yasuhito, and Laura are all PhD students, and 3 of them are all in organizational communication.
All right, so my name is Sandy. I'm going to talk about one of our projects that involves scenario planning. This project was conducted last summer, and we're currently writing a research project about it, and it has both practical and research implications. So last summer, there was a conference where several leaders from different journalism organizations were invited to participate. It was held by the Knight Digital Media Center, they are one of our partners, and it was sponsored by the McCormick Foundation. And these leaders were invited to participate to talk about their current concerns about the industry and where they saw their industry heading. And as many people talk about, this is an industry in flux. It's changing rapidly. The future is very uncertain in the journalism industry, and there's all kinds of implications for this regarding the public sphere, etc. So what we did with this group, we conducted a scenario planning exercise. A month before the conference, we had the leaders participate in an online scenario planning exercise. We built a platform in which they could write narratives about where they saw their industry heading in the next 10 to 15 years. And so we gave them some themes that they could write toward, and we gave them some articles for reference that they could use to create their narrative. So again, we created this innovative platform, and this is one of the first examples of online scenario planning, so we're kind of moving into this area. The 4 topics were a commercial renaissance, which is about the commercialism of journalism. For example, subscription models. And as you can see, Rupert Murdoch is a good example of this kind of model. The nonprofit revolution. So what role do nonprofits and foundations play? Social media role. What role is social media going to play in journalism? How are we going to be accessing journalism? How are consumers going to be participating in this industry? And then finally, hyperlocal augmented reality. Many of us now carry our smartphones around. We can check in different locations. How is this going to affect journalism? So we had these leaders write narratives about where they saw the industry going. Based on their narratives, we created cognitive maps based on the data that emerged. So we had best case scenarios. For example, how can organizations effectively adapt to the changing environment? How can new technology help journalists and their organizations to adapt? And then we also had worst case scenarios. So for example, the fear of the loss of quality was a big one. Are people just going to care about sports and entertainment? Is investigative journalism going to disappear completely because nobody's interested in paying for it? So these were some of the ways we mapped the themes that emerged. And then, so based on this, there were the practical implications where the journalists participating in the conference were able to think about their industry in new ways. And as a result, we've been invited to conduct more scenario planning activities with some of the organizations. And one of the participants actually went back to her news organization and led a scenario planning exercise because she felt like this really helped them think of their organization in a new light and what they could potentially do to help create the picture that they wanted to see and what could be possible. So we also have developed a research project that we're currently working on, and it's looking at data that stems from this conference. So we have interview data, survey data, and then the scenario narrative data. And so we're comparing kind of their current concerns with how they depicted their future concerns and the future drivers of change. And one of the things that we noticed just based on the work that we've done so far is that because this industry is changing so rapidly, it was hard for the journalists to even imagine the future in 6 months versus 5 to 10 years. There's so much uncertainty. So these are the issues that we're looking at with this project. All right, I'm now going to turn it over to Alicia.
Hi. So I'm going to talk about a project we're doing on climate change news and user-generated scenarios. So we're working with a quasi-non-governmental autonomous organization, Cool California, which was created by AB 32, so created by California's emission standards. And the point of Cool California is to spread information about climate change awareness and how to personally reduce people's carbon footprint. So the point is sort of to localize the issue and to bring it home for California residents. And if anyone remembers Prop 23 from the last election, it points to a really big problem that Cool California needs to combat. It points to Prop 23, right, was a proposition which was not voted into law, but the proposition was to sort of put on hold California's carbon emission standards because of the recession. And what it points to is this problem that we get to when we're thinking about such huge issues like climate change, that we get caught in this short-term thinking and sort of lose the big picture, which is one of the problems that Cool California is trying to combat. Two other problems with issues as big as climate change are the problem of localizing such a large issue. The issue comes up in international news and national news. How do we bring it home in a local level, as well as how to keep people engaged? So we came up with this idea called plus climate change, which can be applied to any sort of issue that's as big as climate change. But we're using it with Cool California specifically for climate change. And the point is to mash up the news with climate change. So we're embracing the short-term news cycle in order to use that as a spur to think about longer-term issues and to apply climate change to whatever's in the news right now. So the idea is to use to create an innovative platform that would be a portal for reading the news. So users would read the news through this platform, and they would then read whatever issue is in the news and then add climate change to that issue So to think about how climate change is affected by that issue, how do we apply climate change to that issue? In order to sort of localize it and bring it home and create these user-generated content about climate change in the current news to keep people engaged in an issue like climate change that is so big. And we have potential partners in the journalism school here and in cinema to build this innovative platform, which will helpfully create this engagement with scenario planning. And I'm going to hand it over to...
Hello, my name is Yasuhitabe. Today, my topic is aspect preparedness. But first of all, let me show you one picture. So what is this? Right. Right. It's one of the Fukushima nuclear reactors. Let me ask one critical question. So, but important thing is how or what we can learn from the Japan's crisis. Let me be clear. Japan is one of the best prepared nations in the world for earthquakes. But this crisis showed that Japan did not consider the worst case possibilities. In other words, Japan did not realize their limitations. For example, Japan's earthquake drills are just for short-term survival. Scenario narratives are an important tool for earthquake planning. But the problem is people tend to use it as contingency planning embedded with narratives. But true scenario planning requires multiple simultaneous narratives as well as constellation of multiple events and how they relate to each other and the constellation of uncertainty and unknowns. So our goal is to work with Japanese government and US governmental agencies, and we encourage the scenario narrative shift from single scenario thinking to true multiple scenario thinking. And second, we encourage the interconnected long-term thinking through scenarios. In this case, the relationship between earthquake risks and future energy futures. And third, we investigate ways to communicate results in local media and the culture ecosystem. And let me emphasize here, these issues are highly relevant to California. So I think we should and we can learn a lot from the Japan's crisis. And our possible partners may include these organizations. Thank you.
Okay, so in my research, I'm particularly interested in dynamics of political participation, especially in the European Union and the development of a European Union public sphere. So I think that an important lesson on how to use scenario planning as a tool for effective public communication and civic engagement comes from Africa, especially the Tunisian experience. So after the Jasmine Revolution, a local ad agency in Tunisia developed an international transmedia and a scenario campaign, spreading a vision of a democratic and prosperous Tunisian and asking the publics to share their ideas on how to develop the country after the revolution. An important lesson on scenario planning used as a tool for civic engagement comes also from South Africa. South Africa has an established tradition of using scenario planning, scenario sets for public circulation, and this tradition comes from the famous Mantor scenarios, in which civic society was engaged in a wide discussion about how to develop the South African democracy post-apartheid. So, the European Union has a well-established tradition of scenario planning, but these scenarios exercises tend to remain confined to the sphere of elite an expert discourse. So what I'm interested in doing is to develop scenario exercises, trying to engage the public in Europe. And what I'm interested in doing is I've been working at the European Parliament for a brief period in 2010, and I think that this is a key institution that could be engaged as a partner to try to engage at a grassroots level its constituencies in this scenario planning, in trying to overcome the democratic deficit that the European Union has been facing recently. Thank you.
We'll move on to final reflections. I just want to talk briefly about other ideas we've had for how scenario planning can help innovation around USC. One thing generally is that scenario planning is a great way of to help future-proofing project proposals of any kind, really. It's also a great way of communicating and marketing your ideas. And also, we're actually in talks with an immersive reality company in downtown Los Angeles, which about building a platform for immersive reality scenarios. And finally, we have an idea that perhaps a good idea for an innovation lab would be to develop a scenarios toolkit for the undergraduate entrepreneur teams. And we're always looking for new partnerships and collaborators. So with that, I'll pass it on to Patty to.
When we were asked to do this, we were given a series of questions that we were supposed to talk about. So it's not just that we have all these research projects going on and that we have all these partners, but what have you learned in the process? What would you do differently, as the dean asked? And so one of the things that we learned about scenario planning in general is because it's often used in business by practitioners, that's where you see a lot of the work done. And you also see it in governments. You see our Department of Defense spends a fortune on scenario planning, and I'm not convinced that it has always come out with the best recommendations. And so what we're also trying to do is solve other people's problems as we solve our own. And we're trying to think about putting evaluation in at the beginning and try to collect baseline data. The example of the journalists who were at the KDMC McCormick workshop, they were interviewed before, there's data afterwards, and then we also have each separate company's strategic plan. And so we've got the ability to look at what the process taught people over time. And so we're developing lots of different instruments so that people can look at issues like the capacity for change, the ability to have foresight, to think about these issues. We're also looking at the testimonials from people who've been through the scenario planning process. So in other words, what do they learn? What is it that they found to be important, not just what do we as researchers learn? One of the women, the people who were at this leadership conference last summer were some of the highest ranking people in news and journalism in the world. I mean, we had the leaders of a lot of the major news organizations in the US and Canada. And one of the things that we discovered was they said, we just don't think that way. Because we cover the news, we came up through a long-term thought process is how long does it take to put out a story on something like the Arab Spring. So you're looking maybe 6 months out, maybe 18 months out maximum. And so we met lots of executives in lots of different fields who say that people just don't think that way. So we listened to what they said was important. I mean, one of the women said, this was life-altering to force me to think this way, to force me to read materials that we don't normally read. Because as we build these scenario planning exercises, There's a lot of reading material that we give people. There are videos that we, have people watch. And so there's a whole sort of very mini pedagogy about teaching. And so what is it that we have to do to get people to think differently? And so we'll have more outcome data over time. I think if there was anything that the group probably wishes was that we had known how challenging it was going to be for people to think strategically and to build in an earlier element on strategic thinking as part of the scenario planning process. And so that's really important. The other thing is the outcomes of these scenarios can have actual policy changes. Cool California is an example of that, where you're trying to get a lot of grassroots engagement so that people can start to spread the word that climate change is actually real. And even though, within the confines of the university, that's a relatively well-perceived statement, you can go lots of places around the world and people are climate change deniers. And so how is it that you can actually get people involved? And we're looking at the kinds of policy changes that, would be important. So one of the things that Zhan said at the beginning, we cannot sort of underplay enough. The scenarios field has three bodies that are part of it. There are lots of economists who spend a great deal of time trying to figure out what the data tell us about the future. And there are large groups of economists who work on trend forecasting and trying to figure out what this means in terms of major policy decisions. There's the futures group, which works farther out than that. Most of the future organizations are trying to figure out what's going to happen in the world 10 years, 15 years, 20 years out, right? And then we've got the business practitioners who spend a lot of time doing scenarios, looking at worst-case scenarios, best-case scenarios for different kinds of business strategies. And they tend to work between 1 and 5 years out. And so the key difference is the timeline. But one of the things that we've discovered is that no matter who you're talking to, people really have a very hard time getting more than about 18 months down the road in their minds. And trying to figure out what the world would look like past 18 months has turned out to be extraordinarily challenging, even for people whose jobs this is. And so when we say that the futurists, are sometimes resistant, they are not paying attention to the trend of crowdsourcing, the fact that we now understand how important participatory kinds of communication can be, whether it's overthrowing a government in the Middle East or whether it's creating a whole new marketing plan that before in the past would have been done by a couple of experts, in a room about a table, around a table someplace. And so they still are very focused on looking at experts and experts only and communicating only with experts. And so this whole concept of democratizing, participating, getting young children involved in this so that people start thinking more strategically and building foresight as one of those other capacities that, is going to be important in a world that is extremely volatile and extremely uncertain. And so all the best forecasting tools in the world do not make up for a really good imagination and a great story to help, people understand what the future could possibly be. And so we always hearken back to people, who are profound in ways that they didn't even know at the time. Mark Twain says you can't understand the future and you can't see it if your imagination is out of focus. And so scenario planning is about bringing people's imaginations together and into focus. And so what we wanted to do now is leave the rest of the time for questions and conversation. So thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit, and this is fascinating, I could see all kinds of ways in which you could use this every day. But I wonder if you can walk us a little bit through the actual process of scenario planning and why you think it becomes so difficult for people who normally might be in the business of planning or thinking about the future to engage in it. What makes it so different from what futurists, for example, are doing already?
Well, Zhan, while I scoot back, I'm going to go back to one of Sandy's slides so that we can talk about the process. But talk about the futurists while I look for this slide.
Well, a typical scenario planning process, and there's a very wide range of ways of doing scenario exercises. But one of the most common ways is kind of the GBN approach, which uses a 4-scenario matrix. And their process involves a phase of consultation with stakeholders in the organization who are running the exercise, and with additional research supporting that. And those interviews are designed to identify key issues in the organization, key blind spots. And in the kind of traditional scenario process, the scenarios are then derived from that data through the process of scenario building by the expert scenario planning consultants. And then they run an exercise which involves the key members of the organization or other representatives of interested groups. And that's the traditional kind of face-to-face discussion model, which often usually occurs behind closed doors. It's for the elite executives or other similar level of representatives. Usually ends up in some kind of scenarios report, which is then either used for public communication or circulated within an organization. And it's a way of and this gets at your second question about what makes it difficult for people to what's the challenge, what's the hurdle that people are trying to get past in these exercises. The scenarios are then circulated within an organization, and one of the key ideas is to break past the ingrained habit of most modern institutions of having one official future. So, an official vision for a corporation or government agency or non-profit is created at the top, and then everyone kind of has to follow it. With scenarios thinking and multiple futures thinking, the idea is to create. It's not just about one exercise. It's about creating a culture within an organization which is comfortable with the idea of always thinking in multiple futures, rather than everyone in the organization being steered by kind of semi-blindly by just one overall vision dictated by the people at the top. That's in a nutshell.
Excellent. And so just really quickly, I'll get to you in just a second. One of the things then that you do as part of the process is you start with one of usually 2 models. The Cool California model that Elisheva was talking about, we actually are doing a different model, something that we've created. But typically what happens is you start with major drivers for that particular set of interests, for whatever that problem is. And so in news, you've got the issues of social media, you've got the issue of hyper-local news environments, you've got the fact that lots of people are saying that the commercial news doesn't have a future and that it will all be some form of nonprofit. Or you've got the idea that Rupert Murdoch is going to start locking content behind paywalls, the way the Wall Street Journal has done, which he bought. And then trying to figure out, well, which of these is the most likely future for the news industry? And so then all the news leaders had to go through and write scenarios. What's the best and worst case scenario if it's a commercial renaissance, if that's the future? What if it's a social media where everything actually doesn't come off of the Wall Street Journal's paywall, but instead comes out of Facebook, and that nobody pays any attention to news if it's not on Facebook, right? And so Patch.com is an example of these, atomized, hyper-local kinds of organizations. And then, NPR as, sort of the premier example of a growing nonprofit news organization. And so this would be an example of finding those sorts of drivers within that industry. I ran right after the Department of Defense trained me in simulations and scenarios. They had me run a scenario lab for NATO. And I got to meet all of the NATO leaders, and we boiled things down into 4 possible scenarios about how the U.S. and NATO organizations were going to maintain bases in countries that look like they might be moving over to not be allies of NATO and the U.S. And so we looked at all of the different reasons. And so you've got economic issues, you've got rising fundamentalism, etc. So we had the scenarios that we went through. And then you have people go through and say, if this is the scenario, how do we need to be ready for that? How do you build capacity? And how do you talk to people about it? How do you create an environment where people understand this is our plausible or possible future, and this is what we have to do in order to be ready? And so a lot of this has to do with being able to communicate the vision and the story to people and making the story compelling, which is what we discovered in the NATO example. Was it was very hard for these leaders to go back to the diplomatic side of their governments and work the internal diplomatic issues and the external policy issues. And so that was quite the challenge, yes.
I just want to follow up on that question in terms of how do you integrate real-time data into your model with different parameters, different multivariants of real-world events, and generate some kind of simulation so that you can have multiple outcomes for each scenario, and how do you vary that as well?
That's an interesting real-time data. It's not something that we're working on. I know Institute for the Future has developed, I think they call it, is it the Futures Engine?
Yes,
like
the
Futures
Futures
Engine. And the Futures Engine, one of the ways it can be adapted is to use to read real-time Twitter data.
Right.
So then that would be a way of searching for signals about ongoing trends and leading to future events using tweets. In terms of other ideas, I think that's a really interesting area that we haven't investigated ourselves yet, but there's certainly work being done in the field.
Yeah, and we had an opportunity. I did a talk in Naples about 3 weeks ago at the U.S. Sixth Fleet, where it was a joint set of meetings on strategic communication between U.S. and NATO forces in the transfer from U.S. command over to NATO command for the Libya operation. And one of the things that I learned, and we talked about a possible collaboration, is that they have a very sophisticated monitoring system to look at Google search data and how that's being used in the Middle East. And so we could create, as part of this sort of virtual immersion project that we're looking at, the ability to do real-time data feeds into that. What we do now is pretty close to real-time in the sense that as these workshops and online activities happen, that 1 month period where the journalists, for example, in that 1 month period where they're working, or the upcoming 1 month period for the WorldBank, the lab team, the graduate students and I are constantly updating all of the readings, the videos, the news sites, and people that they have. And so it's 24-hour turnaround during the time frame.
I was at a conference on risk, and there was a member of the forestry speaking, and he was talking about building partnerships. And in the old days, if the public does this and the experts do this, you have an outcome which you can depend on. And they say, given the uncertainty of the project, the possibilities of a range of turnouts, What they do now is they say, if we do this, here are the range of things that might happen or are likely to happen and how to prepare for them. And so the idea of building political solidarity is switched from, if you don't achieve your goal, you failed, to an ongoing partnership, given that we're anticipating together outcomes that are knowledgeable about spending resources might get us part of the way and might have defects, and then we're going to have to readjust. What's going on with modern institutions is, by pursuit of a single future and a single goal, you have credibility crises when you have unanticipated interactive effects, whereas when you shift to managing uncertainty or a range of outcomes, then you can build solidarity on a partnership as to who gets benefits and costs under anticipated conditions.
Right, and so this is completely in line with that concept. A lot of the materials that the participants in the scenario planning process go through are very related to risk. And our contention, from looking at lots of different tools for strategic thinking and capacity building, is that one of the things that is so wonderful about scenario planning is that at the end, people can encapsulate all of those issues of risk. They've got a story that they can hang these issues around. And the concept of that story makes the information that's part of what you're describing more sellable and more memorable, and that makes it more actionable and easier to keep people engaged. That's the contention of the lab.
So you mentioned that there are many people doing scenario planning, the GBMs of the world, the Search for the Future, etc. What do you think is the sweet spot for the Annenberg School and for the work you're doing?
Right.
Is it the immersive lab? Is it different ways to conceive the exercise? Or what's the, or maybe just synthesizing what other people do here?
I think there are three things, and then you folks may have other ideas too that you think are important. The first is the participatory notion. Right now, the concept is still very stuck in an elite model where only certain experts really understand what's going on. And so the notion that you bring lots of people into this and you do them online or in an immersive, sort of environment is very new. The second thing is we are analyzing the data in ways that are not being analyzed in the business world or in the government world. What they're interested in is outcomes. So a business organization goes through all their scenarios and then they say, okay, well, we think, here's what the best case is and this is what we need to do, and here's what the worst case is and this is what we need to do. They don't ever make the connection that we've been able to find in the literature between coming to that decision with that group of people and how that translates to the envisioning process that gets the whole rest of the organization involved. So in other words, where's the transfer? How do those stories then make their way to become either internal or external marketing plans? How does that story increase or decrease engagement because of its credibility or its lack thereof? So in other words, people aren't actually analyzing the narratives the way communication scholars look at narrative. And they're not looking at it as an engagement strategy. They're not looking at it as a capacity strategy. And then the third thing that we're interested in is everybody that we talk to, with the exception of some of the people in the futures organizations, accepts that this is hard to do and that foresight is a capacity that very few people in any given organization have. And they just accept it. They just say, yeah, well, people aren't very good at that. And we're going to hire those 2 or 3 people, who can think into the future. And we hope that, they're also good enough at whatever the industry job is, that they'll also be able to rise to the top. And, through different kinds of, talent management programs, we hope that Shell Oil has somebody who can really think into the future, since energy is one of those places that, has to think hard about the future, right? We've got this concept that says you can build this, that this is a communication concept at its heart. how one begins to talk about the relationship between these issues, how one gets people engaged. It's this kind of communication at the center. You can't see the future until you can start to talk about all of these different ways in which people interact with society, with each other, in teams, understand the group process that leads to the scenarios. And so we actually believe that we'll be able to pedagogically figure out how to build better strategic foresight thinking into the university community through the things that we're learning. And so we've got, I have a meeting in 2 weeks with the head of the ICT lab on how we would create an intelligent agent, you know, an artificial facilitator for a scenario plan where you would put people in it and then they would move the conversation in certain directions depending on what our research principles are for that particular experiment. And so we don't know of anybody who's doing anything related to this. So, other ideas?
I think that's a great summary. I would just add that I think one of the big opportunities for Annenberg is to act as an academic agent of change, which facilitates the transition of the scenarios and futures field to understanding new media theory and practice. I talked a little bit in my presentation about the kind of the lag in the field due to that old guard. But I think that transition is going to come about, but we can ease that process. For example, I'm thinking of the arrival of Jane McGonigal, who you may know as a well-known games guru, video games guru, and an advocate for serious games and so on, who was appointed a couple of years ago as a research director at the Institute for the Future, and is really one of the major pioneers in bringing new media to scenarios and futures, and specifically participatory new media in a games form. And I think she's done really interesting work, and we're partly inspired by her. But there's been a lot of resistance in the futures and scenario planning field to her, because I think Jane remains very much a games guru. I think there's a sense that she's not really interested in engaging with the established body of futures and scenario planning. And there's definitely a real sense of disconnect, and almost like an antagonism almost, between the established futurists and scenario planners and what they see as this Arabist games guru who's kind of come in and eaten their new media lunch. I think we can offer a more conciliatory model. We at Annenberg have expertise in organizational communication, we have expertise in new media from various perspectives, and we're not pushing a particular agenda as Jane is, and Jane is very much the games advocate. And so we can potentially act as that bridge of helping to bring scenario planning professionals and futurists into the new media era without making them feel that they're being colonized or they're being overruled by people coming from outside and so on. So that's where I see the kind of discursive opportunity for us.
We unfortunately have to bring this to an end. There will be classes here in a moment, but I hope that I would also actually, since I see sitting behind me a member of the new generation of futurists and the head of a very innovative idea in Brazil, Mr. Moto, who's visiting us, and working with Henry Jenkins and working on creating a futures of entertainment center and activity, a group called Alchemist, which some of you know, which has a Los Angeles office. So I hope you have a chance to chat with them as well.
Okay.
Excellent.
Right.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
We kept taking your names in.
Excellent. I'd be happy to do that. It's exactly what I've done.
Oh, okay,
Innovation Lab. We're doing a workshop
Wonderful.
just for different kids.
Okay, cool. Well, exactly. So is the Daily Trojan with the...
It's just public events.
Now I got.
So is that the only one?
Said it should
So you have to do
Yep.
it.
But anyway,
Awesome.
I would probably,
Yes, embarrassing.
Nice.
Okay.
Thank you.
Also, I would-
Thanks. Thank you.
Scenario planning and Henry's work and trying to
Hold
put
on just a
everybody
second. They're
together.
taking off and I have to give them
And I love your
a...
idea.
You guys were
That's
fantastic.
exactly what I keep thinking about.
Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely
Can
wonderful.
you
We're
build
gonna
a
have so much fun
sandbox
at
big
Sandy's.
enough?
That was
Without
great.
having it
Well, you
Just
did
a
one.
wonderful
I have a quick question.
You bet.
Are we meeting this afternoon?
Yeah.
Or not?
No.
Next week?
Oh,
But there are lots of
yeah,
other
no,
scenarios.
not this afternoon. Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right.
I'll send you an email.
Yeah, no, I have the no smoking committee, wellness committee this afternoon. Yeah.
Are you? Yeah, I've copied you on both, Melissa. I did.
Well, I have to run. It was good seeing you.
I'm so glad that you could come, and I hope he becomes a Trojan.
I
That's
hope
so
so, too.
exciting.
I did send it. I mean, I sent messages
In fact, I was
to
working
who told me that
Very quickly, when I realized that
And then
your voice is I don't have chance to the ear,
I copied you.
you have it.
It should be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, but where is Lynn?
3 hours east of the ice and that will.
Oh, okay.
Wind River.
Oh, I was gonna say we're going to Yellowstone this summer with some friends from London. 3
Yeah,
hours.
it's a bit. So we're coming from the east, we'll be going right through Lander on the way.
But I unfortunately have to run.
Yeah,
So-
no. Please.
Brazilians are everywhere.
Housing, and then we've got.
Well, just wait until we all
Remote
go.
property that came out of that.
They're
World Cup.
developing it.
Now they're going to build it there with Multiple
So
so
you just
far.
wanted
I'm
to
just
get out
looking.
of LA?
Patty,
That was
thank
part of it. Just
you.
looking at the different scenarios, we're going to point, oh my God, this is
Unreal.
fascinating about what we're going to be doing the world class.
Oh, unreal.
So yeah, I was like, this is but just interesting too.
So, in one of the projects I'm working on is looking at telecenters in Brazil. So, we're especially looking at games. And, as you know, in many telecenters in Brazil, games are really difficult to use or
That's why they prefer.
There you go.
Fascinating. So I was
So
like,
you're gonna do scenarios?
you know what? I'm
We're doing a
definitely
study
thinking
that's
about that
what
alternative.
kinds of skills do we get.
Absolutely. Well, if you need any help, just shoot me an email.
I will do that.
Excellent.
Wonderful. Good to see you.
Wonderful. Oh, it's so good to see you. Yeah, he's in Boston.
Is he?
I'm so sorry.
Okay. Well, Jimmy's been accepted at Notre Dame, and now he's looking in, and hopefully he hasn't been accepted here at USC County. So he's going to have to make a decision between the two when it comes up. So we'll see.
Excellent.
So
Well, good
good.
luck.
Thank you, Patty.
Okay.
I'm so glad you could come. So nice to
Now I
meet you.
understand.
I've heard all about
Good to
you.
meet you.
Francois, thank you so much for coming. I know the last week of school is not the best time for anybody.
And so you said you needed something from me, so if you want to, you just send it to me
You're not
before
gonna,
Monday.
yeah, you're not gonna be here on Monday. I was going to have you help me present the new thing that came out of the Senate on authorship
Right.
because of
yeah.
the faculty council.
Sorry.
But that's all right. I'll
Sorry.
get Tom or somebody to help.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh, excellent.
Because you were mentioning because I was with Susan.
Yes.
We're doing a workshop together right now.
Yeah.
At the Innovation Lab. So Dean said you must come. Now I understood why he said you should be here. Because we're doing many things, projects regarding scenario planning, through storytelling.
Fantastic.
Storytelling methodology. Because it's quite impressive what you're saying that because first we had top-down
It's like, I just wrote this paper that's like, I think it counts for 1% of the grade.
scenarios.
I'm like,
Now you have, so it was more like a linear storytelling, right? A, B, C, D, but now what we have is transmedia storytelling way of scenario planning because it's here, and you have all the stakeholders and the public of interest joining with it.
Oh, fantastic.
So that's why.
So I don't get like categories.
Excellent. Excellent.
Can I only take one
Really impressed with
pass fail?
the video, the
I don't know, I've never seen it.
design.
I can